She possessed one of the greatest jewelry collections in Britain. Her tiaras were so massive that next to them, even the heavyweight diadems of British monarchs seemed light. Yet, she treated these priceless treasures entirely differently. Once, at a dance at Windsor Castle, this woman simply took off her dazzling diadem and shoved it under a chair. Deborah Cavendish wasn't meant to become the Duchess of Devonshire, but it was she who had to save England's greatest estate from an astronomical £7 million debt. And she did it with absolute dignity, turning a historic ruby into her everyday clasp and hiding the secrets of a long marriage in a scattering of diamond spiders and butterflies. Before we begin, please support my channel by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. Let's go back to that evening at Windsor Castle. It was a dance given by the Queen, and Deborah, or Debo as she was affectionately known to her family and friends, came down to dinner dressed exactly as she thought her hostess and the other guests would be. Firmly in place on her head was the great Devonshire diamond palmette tiara, the largest of the three family tiaras. This magnificent piece is a true heavyweight, set with over 1,900 diamonds. But to her absolute horror, none of the other women were wearing theirs. She later recalled sitting through the meal, wishing she was anywhere else, acutely feeling that it is far worse to be overdressed than underdressed. So, what did she do? As soon as the dancing began, she simply took the magnificent tiara off, put it under a chair, and went on to enjoy herself enormously. I find her practical attitude so refreshing. As she humorously noted, Windsor Castle is probably the only house where you could be sure of finding the blessed thing still there at bedtime. It takes a very specific kind of confidence to casually discard 1,900 historic diamonds on the floor. But then again, Debo was a woman of delightful contradictions. Despite having access to genuine museum-quality masterpieces, she was never afraid to wear large, flashy jewels during the day. Observers seeing her sparkle at breakfast might have easily assumed she was wearing historic pieces from the legendary Devonshire collection. But she was just as happy to wear something entirely different. Take, for example, a large camellia brooch with the iconic CC logo, a gift from her friend Jane Wrightsman. It was pure Chanel costume jewelry, set with paste stones. As one admirer wonderfully noted, seeing a duchess wearing big, flashy jewels during the day makes you realize that wanting to sparkle before noon isn't quite as vulgar as one might think. I honestly love this detail about her. Having the keys to one of the most significant collections in the world, she wasn't afraid to wear glass simply because she enjoyed it. Who really was this woman who treated high society rules so lightly? Deborah was the youngest of the 6 famous, and often infamous, Mitford sisters. Her family constantly made headlines. While her older sisters staked out extreme, polarized political positions in the 1930s, and her eldest sister Nancy turned their eccentric childhood into acclaimed novels, Debo simply wasn't interested in politics or scandals. She was always seen as the quiet one, a girl who preferred dogs, chickens, and a simple country life. Her upbringing was so exceptionally free that when her mother let her go hunting alone at just 12 years old, a family friend joked that with 5 other daughters, it didn't really matter what happened to Deborah. She was the youngest, the one who was meant to stay comfortably in the background. She certainly was never expected to become a duchess, let alone the custodian of a staggering aristocratic fortune. The unexpected shift in her destiny began in 1938, the year Debo made her society debut. That was when she met Lord Andrew Cavendish, the second son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire. As Debo later confessed, if it wasn't love at first sight, it was certainly attraction at first sight. From that moment on, for her, nothing and nobody else mattered. Because Andrew was a younger son, neither of them expected to inherit the dukedom or its staggering wealth. When they planned their wedding in the spring of 1941, London was a city under siege. The Blitz had left devastating scars across the capital, yet, amidst the rubble, life stubbornly carried on. They were married in the ancient priory church of St. Bartholomew the Great. Andrew's parents, the 10th Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, were incredibly welcoming to their new daughter-in-law. Among their wedding gifts to Debo was a beautiful pair of diamond and aquamarine clips. With their step-cut and brilliant diamonds framing clear, light blue aquamarines, they are utterly elegant. At that time, wearing her white tulle dress, Debo fully expected a relatively quiet life. They moved into a tiny mews house, anticipating that they might actually be quite poor, and that Andrew would have to carve out a regular career for himself. That expectation of a quiet life vanished in 1944. Andrew's older brother Billy, who had recently married Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, the sister of the future American president, was killed by a sniper's bullet in Belgium. In an instant, the course of their lives was irrevocably altered. Andrew was now the heir. The true, crushing weight of that inheritance fell upon them in 1950. Andrew's father died unexpectedly at the age of just 55. Because he passed away a mere 14 weeks before a crucial tax relief period would have taken effect, the young couple was hit with an 80% death duty. That meant a staggering tax bill of £7 million. A few weeks after the Duke's death, the Dowager Duchess, known as Mucha, quietly handed Debo an old, battered elastoplast tin. It was kept tightly closed with a simple rubber band. When Debo opened this rusty first aid box, she was amazed to find a selection of the Cavendish family jewels. Inside lay row upon row of magnificent pearls, alongside a striking star ruby brooch surrounded by diamonds. The pearls were such an inseparable part of her mother-in-law's identity. Debo had rarely seen Mucha without them, day or night, in town or in the country. Feeling it simply wouldn't be right to take them, she gently handed the pearls straight back. She did, however, keep the star ruby. But rather than wearing it as a traditional pin on a coat, she had a much more practical and stylish idea. She converted the diamond and ruby brooch into a clasp for her own cultured pearl necklace. Paired with a tailored, high-collared shirt, this piece became her absolute signature look. It was her daily uniform, visible in countless photographs and portraits over the next half-century. She loved this ruby clasp so much that it became her daily uniform for decades. She didn't save it for grand state banquets. She wore it doing absolutely everything. There is a wonderful photograph from 1995 of Debo, perfectly put together in her pearls and ruby clasp, casually feeding her beloved chickens. It perfectly captures her unique brand of aristocratic practicality, wearing historic diamonds while tending to the poultry. But her life wasn't all just countryside charm and feeding hens. After the Second World War, enormous stately homes like Chatsworth were largely seen as unwanted relics. Faced with that staggering £7 million debt, Debo and Andrew literally had to roll up their sleeves. To save Chatsworth, they had to make agonizing decisions. It took over 2 decades of tense negotiations with the government, selling off tens of thousands of acres of land, and parting with priceless historical paintings just to slowly chip away at the tax bill. But Debo realized that to survive in the modern world, the estate also had to wash its own face. She became the driving force behind its commercial renaissance. She vastly expanded public access to the house, and as the decades passed, she launched initiatives that were entirely ahead of their time. In 1973, she opened a farmyard to teach city children where their food came from, later followed by a highly successful farm shop and the Orangery gift shop. By the time the debt was finally cleared in 1974, Chatsworth was safe. And miraculously, while historic lands and paintings had to be sacrificed, the core of the Chatsworth jewel collection remained intact. Safely tucked away in those vaults were pieces so extraordinary, so incredibly rare, that they belonged to an entirely different era of imperial splendor. When you first look at the magnificent Devonshire Peru, you might honestly mistake it for something pulled straight out of a theatrical dressing-up box. It is that flamboyant, that massive, and that breathtakingly colorful. This Renaissance revival masterpiece was commissioned in 1856 by the 6th Duke of Devonshire, known as the Bachelor Duke. He had it made by the London jeweler C.F. Hancock for his nephew's wife, Countess Granville, for a very specific, highly intimidating occasion. She was to wear it to the coronation of Tsar Alexander II in Moscow. The idea was clearly to show up and hold their own amidst the legendary, opulent splendor of the Russian imperial court. The parure incorporates a staggering 88 gemstones, but what makes it truly unique is that it is heavily set with ancient Greek and Roman cameos and intaglios taken straight from the second Duke's private collection. Among the vivid carnelians, amethysts, emeralds, and sapphires, there is even a carved portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. The parure consists of 7 distinct pieces: a bracelet, a bandeau, a comb, a coronet, a massive necklace, a diadem, and a stomacher, which is a large, jewel-encrusted triangular piece meant to cover the bodice of a gown. Countess Granville would have carefully selected which pieces to wear depending on the specific coronation event, as 4 of these pieces were separate head ornaments that simply couldn't be combined. Decades later, Debo decided to bring these heavy pieces out of the vault for a rather unexpected occasion. She put on the tiara, along with the companion necklace, the bracelet, and that massive stomacher for a local Women's Institute performance, where she was delightfully cast as the oldest Miss World in the world. I can only smile at the wonderful irony here. Taking a masterpiece designed to impress the Tsar of Russia and casually wearing it for an amateur Women's Institute performance is so perfectly Debo. After the event, she gave a very honest review of the 19th century craftsmanship, stating that the pieces were incredibly prickly to wear. The discomfort is easy to understand when you look at the stomacher. It is a large, rigid, jewel-encrusted triangular piece meant to cover the bodice of a gown, extending all the way down to the waistline. Wearing it is deeply impractical. You essentially have to stand absolutely straight because sitting down while wearing a solid, unbending shield of gold and enamel is practically impossible. It simply has nowhere to bend. Yet, despite all that heavy gold and those prickly gemstones, this parure still wasn't the heaviest thing resting in the Chatsworth vaults. Which brings us right back to that staggering diamond tiara Debo hid under a chair at Windsor Castle. That enormous piece Debo hid under her chair is known as the Devonshire Diamond Palmette Tiara. Commissioned in 1893 by the jeweler A.E. Skinner for Louise, famously known as the Double Duchess, it was actually created by dismantling older family ornaments. The result is a substantial, closed circlet of palmette and lotus motifs, completely paved with stones. To be precise, it holds exactly 1,907 diamonds. We often admire the delicate sparkle of royal jewels on screen, but we rarely consider the sheer, crushing weight of wearing nearly 2,000 diamonds, set in silver and gold, pressing down on your head for hours on end. Debo's grandmother-in-law, Duchess Evelyn, certainly felt every ounce of that weight. As mistress of the robes to Queen Mary, Evelyn accompanied the royal couple to the fabulous, yet grueling, 1911 Delhi Durbar. The schedule was relentless, carried out in the torrid Indian heat. After one particularly long, exhausting evening, Evelyn was overheard saying, "The Queen has been complaining about the weight of her tiara. The Queen doesn't know what a heavy tiara is." I have to smile at that. It takes a very specific kind of aristocratic grit to secretly outsuffer the Queen in the jewelry department. I always find it fascinating how a formal, imposing piece of history can be treated with such complete nonchalance by the women who actually own it. You would assume a tiara of this magnitude would only ever travel in armored convoys. Yet in the 1950s and 60s, Debo's mother-in-law, Mucha, who also served as mistress of the robes, this time to the young Queen Elizabeth II, had a wildly different transportation method. When she needed the palmette tiara for state banquets, she would simply fetch it from the bank and carry it across London, stowed inside an ordinary Marks & Spencer carrier bag. It is a brilliant disguise, really. Who would ever suspect a priceless, historic masterpiece to be sitting next to someone's groceries? Debo herself had a similarly casual attitude toward the family diamonds, one that occasionally bordered on the reckless. She once recalled going to a party in London in the early 1960s. Because Andrew had another engagement, she went entirely alone, confidently wearing the massive palmette tiara. When the party wound down long after midnight, she simply walked out onto the street to look for a taxi. She later admitted it never even occurred to her that standing alone on a dark pavement with a load of diamonds around her neck and 1,900 more glittering above her head might not be the safest idea. I absolutely love this visual. A duchess just trying to hail a cab while glowing like a chandelier in the London night. Speaking of her glittering social life in the 60s, there is another spectacular piece that perfectly captured her glamorous circle. Debo was just as comfortable with traditional aristocrats as she was with artists, writers, and even the rock and roll crowd. In 1969, she attended the famous White Ball in London's Holland Park, hosted by Prince Rupert Lowenstein, who famously served as the financial manager for the Rolling Stones. For that evening, she was photographed alongside the legendary Cecil Beaton, wearing a breathtaking Belle Epoque aquamarine and diamond brooch. Crafted around 1905, the jewel features a massive oval-cut aquamarine set horizontally within a delicate diamond border, suspending a large, detachable, pear-shaped aquamarine drop. It is a piece of pure, classic elegance that somehow fit perfectly into the swinging 60s. Dressing for a high society ball is relatively easy compared to the strict demands of a coronation, especially when you suddenly realize you are missing a crucial part of your outfit. Years earlier, the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II required every ounce of Devonshire splendor. But as Debo was preparing for the ceremony, a rather frustrating problem arose. One that would lead to a truly unexpected discovery hidden deep within the Chatsworth archives. As the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II approached, the Devonshire household was in a flurry of preparation. The Dowager Duchess, Mucha, as mistress of the robes to the young queen, naturally required the grandest of the family jewels. She claimed the massive palmette tiara and the primary crimson purus robes that had been carefully stored away since the 1937 coronation. This left Debo, the newly minted duchess, in a bit of a wardrobe crisis. Where on earth do you find a spare purus robe when every senior aristocratic lady in the country has already claimed theirs? Chatsworth, as always, came to the rescue. The estate's archives held a number of old tin storage boxes, and the family began a rather desperate hunt. Digging through one of these tins, beneath what Debo described as a ton of tissue paper, they miraculously uncovered a second crimson robe. And not just any robe. It originally belonged to the 6th Duke of Devonshire's sister, Lady Georgiana Cavendish, wife of the 6th Earl of Carlisle. The tactile reality of this discovery is just incredible. The velvet was of such exceptional quality that it was so soft your fingers hardly knew they were touching it. And the color was so vibrant, such a pure, brilliant crimson, that it practically made you blink when the light hit it. Unearthing a pristine piece of 18th century fashion history and bringing it back to life for a new Elizabethan era must have felt like absolute magic. A robe that's spectacular naturally demands jewels that can hold their own against it. With the palmette tiara already taken by her mother-in-law, Debo reached for another masterpiece from the vault, the Devonshire Diamond Honeysuckle Tiara. Created around 1865, this exquisite piece features 7 large, intricate diamond honeysuckle motifs set over a substantial diamond base. It's a beautifully versatile creation that can be removed from its frame and worn as a necklace or broken down into separate brooches. But for the solemnity of Westminster Abbey, she wore it in its full, towering glory. Yet the real masterstroke of her coronation outfit was her use of the Devonshire Diamond Riviere. Reset in the 1920s into its current configuration, this spectacular jewel features 24 massive cushion-shaped diamonds. It is the kind of necklace that commands absolute attention. But rather than wearing it in the traditional way around her neck, Debo cleverly attached the entire diamond riviere directly to the neckline of Georgiana's historic crimson robe. It created a breathtaking waterfall of diamonds against that impossibly bright velvet. She looked every inch a true duchess on that historic day, flawlessly draped in centuries of Cavendish heritage. But in her everyday life, Debo preferred entirely different, much stranger jewels, pieces that told the true story of her long marriage far better than any written memoirs could ever do. Debo was delightfully eccentric, entirely unbothered by what people might expect from a duchess. This was a woman who adored Elvis Presley so much that she dedicated an entire powder room to his memorabilia. She also had an absolute obsession with poultry. She bred hens and chickens with the same dedication others applied to racehorses, and she loved incorporating them into her grand life. Once, when hosting the legendary couturier Oscar de la Renta for dinner at Chatsworth, she bypassed traditional floral centerpieces entirely. Instead, she decorated the dining table with glass boxes filled with live, pecking chicks. But beyond rock and roll and poultry, her most famous and personal passion was a highly unusual collection of jewelry. She didn't just own one or two novelty pieces, she accumulated a veritable swarm of precious insects. These glittering bugs were far more than just a quirky fashion statement. They served as a glittering timeline of a complex, sometimes painful, but enduring 63-year marriage. Her marriage to Andrew lasted for 63 years, but it certainly wasn't a flawless fairy tale. Behind the grand facade of Chatsworth, they endured profound tragedies, including the loss of 3 children shortly after birth. Debo also had to navigate Andrew's well-known struggles with alcoholism and his public infidelities. When asked later in life how she managed it, her response was remarkably pragmatic and incredibly honest. She simply stated that she thought working through it was far better than divorce. As she put it, "Divorce is so final. It never occurred to me to be divorced." Instead of walking away, they stayed together, and their bond was chronicled through a very specific tradition. Andrew gave her an insect brooch for every single wedding anniversary. The collection began with a beautiful yellow and white diamond butterfly in 1941. Over the decades, the swarm grew to include beetles crafted from cabochon garnets, caterpillars made of polished citrines with onyx eyes, and spiders boasting large cultured pearls or cabochon rubies. Debo loved to wear them, and she didn't just pin one neatly to her collar. She wore them in literal swarms. People fondly remember seeing her at over 80 years old, impeccably mannered and perfectly elegant, with 6 huge, jeweled bugs crawling up the arms of her jacket. On other occasions, she would pin every single bug and butterfly she owned all at once onto a black velvet bolero. Speaking of her wonderfully eccentric approach to family history, there is one spectacular event we absolutely cannot overlook. In the year 2000, Debo and Andrew both turned 80. To celebrate, they threw a massive Millennium Party at Chatsworth. In true Debo fashion, the invitation simply said, "Fancy dress." But for her own costume, Debo decided to dive deep into the Chatsworth archives. She unearthed an authentic piece of fashion history, a magnificent gown designed by the legendary House of Worth in Paris. This dress had originally been made for Louise, the famous double Duchess of Devonshire, to wear at the historic 1897 Devonshire House Ball, which celebrated Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Louise had attended that ball dressed as Zenobia, the ancient Queen of Palmyra. The gown itself was a breathtaking creation of green and gold shot silk gauze, featuring a velvet train lavishly embroidered with jewels, metalwork, and gold and silver thread. As Debo herself noted, the entire confection weighed a ton. However, there was a slight problem. The elaborate original headdress from 1897 had been lost. Never one to be discouraged, Debo simply improvised using the vault. She reached for the largest of the 3 family tiaras, the massive Devonshire diamond palmette tiara. To give it that theatrical, historical impact, she casually adorned the priceless diamond tiara with large ostrich feathers. That party in 2000 was a magnificent celebration of her life, but it also brings us back to the story of her marriage. While things between Debo and Andrew were certainly not always smooth, and they had to weather their fair share of storms together, he never stopped surprising her with deeply romantic gifts. He actually had a history of finding spectacular heart-shaped jewels for her. Back in 1961, he purchased the breathtaking Craven brooch at auction. Originally created in the 1890s for an American dollar princess, Cornelia, Countess of Craven, it features 2 deep blue cashmere sapphires set within paired diamond hearts, suspending a rare pear-shaped pink diamond. It is an absolute showstopper, and cleverly, it can even be worn as a bangle. Debo clearly cherished this gift, wearing it beautifully throughout the decades, particularly to the weddings of her own children. But in 2001, to mark their diamond wedding anniversary, 60 years of marriage, Andrew commissioned something entirely new and deeply personal. He went to Armour Winston in London and ordered a beautiful brooch designed as a heart pierced by an arrow, heavily pavé set with brilliant cut diamonds and centered with a large heart-shaped stone. Later that year, the Duke and Duchess hosted a tea party at Chatsworth for several hundred local Derbyshire couples who had also married in that difficult year of 1941. They completely transformed the atmosphere, laying out a week's worth of actual World War II food rations on trestle tables, 2 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of butter, much to the absolute astonishment of their younger guests. An orchestra played songs made famous by Vera Lynn, like We'll Meet Again and The White Cliffs of Dover. Debo walked among her guests with the new diamond heart pinned to the shoulder of her coat, while around the room, elderly couples sang along to the songs they still remembered from wartime dances and blackout evenings. I think that is what makes this celebration feel so touching even now. Beneath all the grandeur of Chatsworth and the glitter of aristocratic diamonds, this was ultimately a room full of people who had simply endured the century together. That brilliant afternoon was one of the final great milestones they shared. 3 years later, in 2004, Andrew passed away. It is often said that holding on to power and status is human nature, but Debo proved to be the beautiful exception. Without any fuss or dramatic farewells, she quietly gathered the magnificent palmette diadem, the versatile honeysuckle tiara, the grand diamond riviere, and handed them all over to her daughter-in-law, Amanda. Her explanation for this was remarkably simple and completely devoid of ego. She wrote, "It was not mine, just as it had not been Mucha's. It belongs to Chatsworth, to be worn by the wife of the Duke of Devonshire." Leaving the sprawling palace she had saved and restored, she moved into the old vicarage on the edge of the estate. She decorated it entirely herself, filling it with her beloved dogs and her endless collections of books, leaving the grand stage to the next generation. It is a rare woman who can walk away from one of the greatest jewel collections in Europe with such absolute, graceful peace. Deborah passed away in 2014 at the age of 94, outliving all her sisters and an entire era of aristocratic history. When her personal belongings were auctioned at Sotheby's a few years later, the catalog was a brilliant reflection of who she really was. Magnificent diamond brooches and gifts from couturiers were listed right alongside her novelty Elvis telephone and monogrammed traveling boxes for her chickens. She simply never took herself too seriously, even when she spent half her life surrounded by some of the most significant treasures in Britain. It is so rare to find a historical collection where the jewels, as magnificent as they are still somehow outshined by the sheer personality of the woman who wore them. If you found her story as touching and fascinating as I did, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel to see more stories from the royal vaults. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which piece of her collection would you have loved to see in person? The grand, historic heirlooms, or her highly personal swarm of diamond insects? Thank you so much for watching and for spending this time with me. Because in the end, jewels may be silent, but their stories are not. And they won't be as long as we keep telling them.